undeniably at certain levels extremely complex. But what I would argue is that it is at the same time simple, complicated, and complex. And I will separate complicated and complex and by saying that something that is complex cannot be, it can be designed, but it can't be controlled or predicted. It's much like the stock market, right? You can't control or predict it. And in some ways, a great deal of humor falls into that category. We cannot completely predict or control the way it operates, and it is something that evolves by itself. But that is not the entire realm of humor. There is also humor that is merely complicated. Complicated being something that more like a jet engine, while it may be able to, it may be extremely involved and have many different parts and aspects, it can be created, predicted, and controlled. And there are other aspects of humor that are just plain simple. So there are various different things that can be worked on. And at the moment, and for some time, there is this tendency to work on things that are very complicated, to try and figure out methods of detecting satire, methods of detecting irony, and methods of generating puns and generating acronyms. These things are all filled with meaning. They're all filled with context. They're extremely complex things that will vary not only from country to country, region to region, but room to room and person to person. These things are extremely variable. They're extremely complex. But these are the things that we often take on. These are the things that we're trying to decode. And if you use the analogy of building a house, I would say that while we should be concerning ourselves with clearing the land, cutting down the trees, and pouring the concrete foundations, we're busy standing around trying to figure out triple glazing. And there's nowhere to put it, and it's beyond what we're capable of doing right now. We have to work on the fundamentals. One of the reasons that this tendency has occurred is because of the connection that people have with jokes and laughter, jokes and humor. Jokes always comes up, jokes. I mean, ever since I've been a comedian, people are like, oh, you're a comedian, tell me a joke. Do you have a joke? You must have a joke for me. And the truth be told, after 27 years of being on stage, I can count the number of jokes I've told on two hands. You know, it isn't a particularly relevant construct in stand-up, but it's also not a particularly relevant construct in the idea of generating humor. Jokes are too complicated and involved. The idea of figuring out all the different aspects of a simple joke. You know, an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scotsman walk into a bar, and each one of them has a fly in their beer, and the joke goes from there. Well, all the different aspects that have to be understood and correlated if something was to create something like that and successfully deliver it, it's extremely complex. So and the truth of the matter is that's not really even a big problem in terms of generating humor in artificial intelligence, because we don't write jokes. You tell them. I mean, somebody must write them. I don't know who they are, though. Jokes are almost folkloric. If you say to yourself, if someone asked you, how many jokes do you know? Maybe you know a dozen. Maybe you know 20. Maybe if you're really into it, you know 50. Right? How many of them did you write? Did you construct? You didn't. Maybe you did, but it's very unusual. Generally speaking, we repeat them. We hear them and we repeat them. That is something that digital technology is very, very good at. Compiling things and repeating things. So, it's not even as big a problem as we have. The other problem is the idea, I said jokes and laughter. Laughter is problematic because it's another thing that's often used as a yardstick of amusement. People, you know, again, I'll reference teaching stand-up, but it goes much beyond that. People, when they first start doing stand-up, they have this sense like, I have to make people laugh, I have to make them laugh. But the truth of the matter is that there's a broad spectrum of appreciation of something that's humorous. Laughter is just at the very far end of it. And if we consider laughter to be the only way we're measuring things, it becomes very, very difficult. So there's a very broad, I mean, the French word, the French word for smile is sourire, which badly translated means sub-laugh. It's underneath a laugh. And the reason, going into a bit of origin at this point, the reason the smile even exists is because you physically have to go through it when you laugh. You can't go to without going to first. So when you go into a laugh and when you go out of a laugh, you have to go there, right? So while the baring of teeth means something in the animal kingdom, for us it means something completely different, and it was dictated by this physiology. Now what I'm going to do quickly here is I'm going to go through a few of the ideas that I have regarding the origins, nature, and functions of humor. I'll go through that quickly, and then I'm going to get into how we can actually apply things. Before we had humor, laughter existed from tickling. So we're going back, you know, sort of to throw around figures, say 9-odd million years ago. You'd have laughter through tickling, and eventually laughter managed to be created, the creation of laughter managed to escape from the boundaries of the physical. Someone was actually able to create laughter without touching, without the actual touch. And it's a fairly reasonable hypothesis that it occurred as a result of something that was almost a touch. Almost that tickle, that predicted moment where it was like, it was that prediction of it just about to happen. But the touch didn't actually happen. So all of a sudden, you have no physical cause and effect. All of a sudden, you have perception is causing laughter. And it's that break, it's that moment, it's this. This is essentially, that's the first joke, is this movement, this thing. That break in the pattern is what humor began as. So things that were breaks in pattern caused this laughter. And what's interesting is that it serves as a reward system in and of itself. Because when you laugh, I mean, without getting into a detailed list of all the different psychological and physiological benefits that occur, there are lots, right? People feel good, and you know, the endorphins that are released, and it's a good experience. The social aspect of what happens when people laugh, not to mention the fact that it activates mirror neurons. So when you hear somebody laugh, it actually fires off exactly the same part of your brain as when you laugh yourself. So humor is like empathy in a bottle. It's a way of feeling exactly the same and bonding yourself with the people who are around you. So you have a reward system that's in place. Now, this has had a profound effect, it's my belief, it had a profound effect on our cognitive evolution. Because what you've got is this desire to break patterns, and it's encouraged by a reward system. That in order to find out a break in a pattern, you by default have to determine what the pattern is itself. So when you're through play creating a break in a pattern and recognizing a break in a pattern, through the laughter it elicits or the smiling it elicits, you've recognized a pattern. Humor and laughter as a bipartite system is a pattern recognition system. So all of a sudden you have a pattern recognition system that's fed by reward. So you want to do it and do it and do it and do it. Not to mention the fact that it also involves the vocal apparatus. And this is long before we were doing anything that vaguely resembled speaking. You have the vocal apparatus which is at work, and doubtless at some point, long before language, somebody decided they would try and elicit laughter by changing patterns of sound. Right? And so the vocal apparatus was exercised and put into action and used as a communicative tool. So that leads us to the idea that humor is foundational. Laughter and humor are foundational in language itself. You have communication going on, because you have, when somebody laughs, you become aware of their physical state as well as their opinion of what they're experiencing. So you have communication, and you have the organization of information. You have informatics. You have a pattern being recognized. So you have the transfer of information, and you have information organization and communication. These are the building blocks of what language is, not to mention the use of the vocal apparatus. So this is fundamentally part of the way we communicate. So it's very different from the way we have a tendency to look at humor as this extraneous thing, as something that's entertainment, it's an aside, it's that's just a joke. It is actually fundamental to the way we perceive ideas and process things and communicate. It's part of the building blocks of how we both think and how we communicate. And this comes into play in terms of design. So, as time goes on, humor has a mimetic quality. It's basically, it serves as a meme. It attaches itself to anything. So you can have humor that attaches itself to numbers. You can find things that amuse you within a pattern of numbers, within social structures, within psychology, sociology. Anywhere where we can perceive patterns in our universe, in our own mind, they can be broken and humor can be created, right? So all these other theories that have to do with, with dominance and with self-aggrandizement and everything else, these are all things that are, added on as time goes on and are reflective of the human condition. So it's become extremely complex because the humor itself is as complex as whatever system it's working with or commentating on. It's exceedingly complex. It can be as complex as like I said, the system or the ideas that it's playing with. But that doesn't mean that it's unapproachable. So how do we approach it? What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? I'm very into being pragmatic. And let's break it down. First of all, you've got, if you really want to establish the fundaments, you've got breaks and patterns. At its root, you have breaks and patterns, and which still exist today. Humor involves breaks and patterns. But there's an ironic structure in that it also involves the recognition of comic heritage. So if things have been funny to you before, they're going to be funny to you again. Because this whole idea of surprise, there's this notion that humor is surprise, it's a break in a pattern, it's a surprise. But what that doesn't take into account is the fact that if you have a favorite funny movie, you'll watch it again and again and again. Or if you've ever been at a social gathering and there's some man in his 70s and he always tells the same joke every time, he laughs because he loves that joke, because it's his favorite joke. Why is he laughing every time? He knows it, he's told it 100 times. That's because there's the recognition of comic heritage. So there's this idea of what has been funny in the past mixed with the idea of breaks in patterns. Add to that the idea that there is this scale of meaning. Right? So there are things that have, as I was talking about before, that have a great deal of meaning and frame and context that are extremely complicated, and there are things that have no meaning. There are some things that have you can add meaning to them if you wish, but the basic essence of it, like someone simply crossing their eyes, is generally considered to be amusing, even though there's no specific meaning that necessarily has to be attached to it. It's a mechanical gesture that breaks the fundamental pattern of where your eyes are. Very simple. So, what things are simple? What things can be done? Well, I would start off with sound and movement. I'd leave language alone entirely. Well, not entirely, we'll get into language. But sound and movement don't possess the complexities that language puts on the table. So when you simply have sound and movement, you can really put these things together well. And the nice part is, if you're looking at putting sound and movement, for say for example, into a robot, a lot of the research has been done. Felix the cat, Mickey the mouse, Charlie the Chaplain. I mean, in the 1920s, they were all doing just that, doing studies of what fundamental movements are funny around the world. Charlie Chaplin was beloved around the world. These are things that are universal in terms of, in terms of movement that were studied, and in terms of movements of groups and so forth. I mean, the documentation of it is what's necessary, though. The categorization, the taxonomy doesn't exist. There needs to be documentation, there needs to be taxonomy, there needs to be organization, there needs to be structure. And that can come from all kinds it can come from, looking at the study that mimes have, clowns have, puppeteers. Puppeteers are fabulous. That's really what they're concerned with, is this whole idea of evoking emotion and often humor through movement. And they know exactly, you move this that much, that much relative to that. Okay, so you have comic movement has been studied, but what it hasn't been done, it hasn't been organized. If you move, even within language, there are certain tools within language that can create humor that don't really require a tremendous amount of meaning. Simple things like repetition and alliteration. Repetition is a particularly important tool because repetition also establishes the idea and works with the idea of the heritage of the humor itself. So if you laugh at something once, and you repeat what that thing is. Comedians do this all the time. They call it callbacks. At the end of the show, they'll do something they made you laugh with at the beginning, and they'll sometimes do it 2 or 3 times. It's creating its own heritage. So the repetition works with it creating its own heritage. So it's working with both sides of the equation. It's breaking the pattern and working with the idea of heritage. So, but language starts obviously to bring things into a more complicated realm, but there's still aspects of it which are complicated rather than complex. And I know Anton, for example, has worked with prosody, which is the song that you have with your voice, the ups, the downs, where does it go, how does it work, And prosody, as an example, is something that if it was studied and given more structure, given more taxonomy, really figured out how it works within humor, what kind of prosody is humorously effective, then that is something that could be established. It would probably most likely vary from language to language, but it is approachable. It is complicated. It is not complex. It is not beyond us. We can work with things like that. Also things like catchphrases, slang, euphemisms, and often things like that are forgotten because they don't necessarily make you burst out laughing. It's not their purpose to use a euphemism for something or a nickname for something. The purpose of using it isn't just to bust a gut. But even the term bust a gut, it's nice. These are things that they are in the realm of being humorous themselves. They're engaging, they're amusing. Which is what, I'll go back to robots. In the case of a robot, you don't necessarily want it whizzing around trying desperately to make you convulse with laughter. But if it's constantly keeping you in a slightly higher, more positive, amused state, as opposed to being either neutral or negative, people are going to want to spend more time with it. The studies have been done in that regard. And when people are dealing with a humorous robot, they feel not only that they would that it is smarter than the non-humorous robot, but they also feel like they would want to spend more money to buy one. So these become practical and pragmatic concerns in the world of business as well. And then if you move on to, of course, complex systems, as I mentioned, just because something is complex, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's unusable because it can still be repeated. And I use jokes as the example, and there are numerous different things which can simply be repeated and used that way. Even though they're complex, we can't, artificial intelligence, at least at this point in time, can't be put in a situation where it can spontaneously create such things. It can reference a vast database of them. And this brings me to the idea that there are actually some things that robots, artificial intelligence, what have you, will be able to do that are more, that we don't have access to. They will actually be more capable in certain realms of producing humor than human beings will. There are things they can do that we can't do that they can create humor with, which is an intriguing concept, though it might not play in favor of us liking to feel that we're superior. But the jokes are a great example. As I was saying, if we had a joke master in the room, they would probably know 50 jokes. Computer, can know millions of jokes. And if you have systems that are out there that are interconnected, every time there's a new one that pops up, it knows it too. So, and with the feedback that exists, if you can measure the feedback, and that's something that a lot of people, the work that's been going on that I'm seeing, you know, being able to measure the metrics of facial expression, being able to measure what bodies are up to, being able to hook things up, to measure brain activity, whatever it is, all these different ways of measuring amusement. If they can measure the level of amusement and correlate it with the humor that it is using to create, or even that someone else in the scenario, I could even watch two human beings communicating, determine the humor, determine its efficacy, determine how well it functioned or how well it did not function. It can start to map these things out. You know, for example, if you have a personal robot or avatar that lives with you, it will be able to figure out what time of day you are more likely to be amused, because it will be gathering that information over the course of time. Patterns will emerge. These are things that we may or may not, as human beings, be able to achieve ourselves. So there are also things, for example, they can, mimicry, it's another thing that we talked about before. Mimicry is a very fundamental human thing to do, and it is something that has the potential to do extremely well, to the point where it can actually record your own voice and play it back to you. Right? Or it could do it, instead of doing an impression of somebody, it could actually play back a recording. It could all of a sudden become John Wayne. It could do whatever, be whatever. It can transfer these things. All of a sudden it can produce the sounds of an animal, and this crossover, this anthropomorphing, this idea of giving a human voice to animals is another very common comic tool. Gary Larson, The Far Side, those cartoons, almost every one of those involved the simple mechanism of going, okay, here's an animal, and the animal has an opinion. That's what was the device that created humor for him. So and if you have the ability to produce sounds, characters, personalities through digital means, then it can create humor that way. So there are all these different ways. It can also do things. It could speak, for example, it could change the pitch of its voice, or it could say things impossibly quickly. It can do all these different things that have the potential. It has its own structures, its own patterns, its own abilities, and these patterns it can create patterns that break with our own notions, and it can do things and break its own patterns. So it has a whole different realm of being able to create humor in and of itself. So, to sum up, I think that what's extremely important is to document, categorize, create a taxonomy, to create a compendium of all things that are fundamental and common. And I send this as a challenge out to everybody here. If you're working with movement, if you're working with anything that's fundamental, so not necessarily based in language or involving meaning and context, but things that are simple. So if, for example, you're involved in movement, I'd love you to document all the things you notice that just seem to be funny, that involve the movements that you are involved in producing and creating. And let me know. Or let yourself know. Let somebody know. This information has to be harvested, and everybody here, almost everybody here, is working in fields where it's applicable. If you're working in sound, what aspects of sound are just naturally amusing and just seem to cause amusement naturally in and of themselves? So these fundaments, these simplistic things, they need to be documented, they need to be put together, we need to organize these things and take on these fundamentals. And while the sense of humor that artificial intelligence, that a robot can have, may not be identical to our own, it can function well, it can work very well in human interaction, it has the potential to do that, and it also has the potential to evolve and to create its own sense of humor, whatever that is. It does have the potential to do that and become its own complex system. And at that point, I guess we'll be trying to emulate that. But anyway, thank you very much.